A WTA official just shattered 5 years of enforced silence, and what spilled out could dismantle professional women's tennis as the world knows it. A $500 million shadow fund, phantom accounts hidden beneath the floorboards of the sport's most powerful governing body, and at the center of it all, a 22-year-old Filipino champion named Alex Ayah, whose meteoric rise apparently threatened the wrong people. Nobody predicted this level of institutional rot. Nobody calculated this depth of calculated sabotage. One brave insider stepped forward, handed federal authorities a briefcase of encrypted documents, and suddenly, the FBI was circling the WTA's headquarters in St. Petersburg, Florida. This isn't gossip. This isn't tabloid speculation. This is the moment the curtain tore in half. She was never supposed to get this far. That, in retrospect, appears to have been precisely the problem. Alex Ayla arrived on the professional circuit carrying something beyond talent. She carried momentum. A junior Grand Slam title won before she could legally rent a car in most countries, a work ethic forged on the unforgiving courts of the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, where soft dreams dissolve and only iron ones survive. A serve that had coaches across 3 continents revising their scouting notes, and, crucially, a name, a face, and a story that represented something the sport had never genuinely embraced: Southeast Asian excellence demanding its place at the table without apology. The Philippines celebrated her the way nations celebrate their rarest, most precious exports. Streets in Manila lit up when she triumphed. Children printed her face on notebook covers. A generation of young Filipino girls who had grown up watching tennis as a sport belonging entirely to Europe and North America suddenly believed the geography of greatness had shifted. Within the WTA's institutional ecosystem, however, the response was more complicated. Sources close to the organization, sources whose careers were built inside that infrastructure, describe a particular atmosphere that developed around Ayla's ascent. Not hostility, precisely, cooler than hostility, more deliberate. The kind of resistance that never announces itself openly, that never leaves fingerprints on official paperwork, but that a perceptive young athlete would feel pressing against her from every direction simultaneously. Scheduling anomalies began surfacing. Ayla repeatedly found herself drawn against opponents in conditions that statistically favored everyone else in the bracket. Wildcard allocations that observers and journalists described as bizarre, decisions that could not be explained by ranking logic or competitive rationale, seemed to materialize whenever her name appeared near the top of seedings. Equipment malfunctions at precisely inopportune moments, media access curtailed, coaching staff temporarily denied court access during warm-up sessions in ways that violated tournament protocol. Any single incident could be dismissed as administrative oversight, bureaucratic inefficiency, the chaotic machinery of a global professional sport grinding impersonally onward. But when these incidents accumulated across months, across continents, across governing committees that were supposed to operate independently of one another, a pattern materialized that demanded explanation. The explanation, it turns out, had a dollar figure attached to it. 500 million of them. The people who built the fund understood one essential truth about institutional power. It never announces its agenda. It simply shapes the environment until the environment makes certain outcomes inevitable. Alex Ayla was talented enough to survive unfavorable environments. She was determined enough to push through every manufactured obstacle. What her enemies had not anticipated was that someone on the inside was watching, documenting, and eventually deciding that conscience was worth more than a career. That decision would trigger a federal investigation that no spin operation on Earth can contain. Buried inside the financial architecture of a governing body that oversees hundreds of millions of dollars in prize money, sponsorship allocation, and broadcast licensing fees, a discretionary pool of extraordinary size had been quietly constructed over nearly a decade. $500 million. Not in one account, not in one jurisdiction, distributed across at least 11 offshore holding structures, routed through shell entities incorporated in Cyprus, the Cayman Islands, and one particularly opaque arrangement in Liechtenstein that federal investigators would later describe in court filings as deliberately structured to frustrate conventional audit methodology. The fund did not appear anywhere in the WTA's publicly filed financial disclosures. It did not appear in the annual reports presented to member nations or broadcast partners. It did not appear in the documentation reviewed by the organization's external auditors, because, according to sources with direct knowledge of its operation, the auditors reviewing official documents were reviewing documents that had been specifically curated to omit the fund's existence entirely. What did the fund do? This is where the testimony of the whistleblower becomes not merely significant, but staggering in its implications. According to the information delivered to federal authorities, the fund served multiple coordinated purposes. First, it financed a network of intermediaries, agents, scheduling officials, physiotherapy, and sports medicine providers attached to tournaments, whose responsibility was to create what insiders apparently described internally as friction environments around targeted players. Not physical harm, nothing that crude. Friction. Administrative complications, surface condition manipulations within the allowable variance of tournament regulations, logistical delays engineered to disrupt preparation, nutritional supply chain interference, the kind of sophisticated, deniable sabotage that a paranoid player would struggle to articulate publicly without appearing irrational. Second, the fund financed a media operation. Not journalism, the architecture of journalism, functional websites, credentialed press passes, social media amplification networks, deployed to generate narratives that would frame certain rising players as controversial, difficult, ungrateful, or politically inconvenient. Stories that would make sponsors uncomfortable. Stories designed to trigger the one mechanism that frightens professional athletes more than any injury: commercial abandonment. Third, and most explosively, the fund was allegedly used to directly influence the composition of ranking committees and tournament seeding bodies. Not through bribery in the crude transactional sense, but through the architecture of incentive. Financial arrangements structured as legitimate consulting agreements, advisory retainers, and strategic partnership payments that created dependency relationships between fund recipients and the interests the fund served. Ask yourself this: how does a player with Eala's documented performance metrics end up outside the seedings that her numbers demand? How does a competitor who has defeated higher-ranked opponents on multiple surfaces find herself consistently placed in bracket positions that maximize her exposure to adverse conditions? The answer was never about tennis. It was about money. It was always about money. And now, at last, the money has left a trail. Her name has not yet been released publicly. Federal investigators have maintained a protective seal around her identity while preliminary proceedings continue. But the profile that has emerged through sources familiar with the investigation is striking in its specificity. She is a senior compliance official who spent 11 years inside the WTA's financial governance structure. She held a position that granted her access to documents that most of the organization's own leadership never reviewed directly. She is described by colleagues as methodical, precise, and, in the 18 months before she approached the FBI, increasingly isolated from the inner circles she had previously inhabited. What triggered her decision to act was not a single document. It was the cumulative recognition of a pattern she had been watching develop across years, combined with a specific incident involving Alex Ayah's preparation for a tournament that sources describe only as a major event in the European clay season. Eala's logistical arrangements for that tournament were interfered with in a manner so brazen, so architecturally deliberate, that the compliance official, whose professional life had been dedicated to ensuring organizational integrity, finally understood that the system she had trusted was operating in fundamental opposition to everything it publicly claimed to represent. She copied documents. She did this carefully over an extended period in a manner that avoided detection. She compiled financial records, internal communications, payment authorization trails, and what investigators describe as meeting summaries from closed sessions of the Ranking Oversight Committee that were never entered into official minutes. Then she retained legal counsel. Then she contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Then she waited while federal investigators assessed what she had brought them, confirmed its authenticity, and began building a case of sufficient weight to survive the legal challenges that a well-resourced institutional defendant would inevitably mount. The waiting period lasted 7 months. 7 months during which the fund continued operating. 7 months during which Alex Ayah continued competing, excelling despite everything working against her, because excellence turned out to be the one thing the fund could not purchase or prevent. 7 months during which the whistleblower attended her regular meetings, submitted her regular reports, and gave no indication to anyone around her that federal investigators were constructing a case around documents she had carried out of a building in a briefcase. That kind of sustained courage deserves its own conversation. That kind of quiet, patient, terrifying determination to do the right thing regardless of personal cost is rarer than any athletic gift. When history eventually documents this moment fully, her contribution will be understood as equally significant as anything that happens in a courtroom. The morning federal agents arrived at WTA headquarters, they brought 3 things: warrants, hard drives, and an unmistakable signal to everyone watching that this investigation had progressed far beyond the preliminary assessment stage. Court documents reviewed by legal correspondents covering the case reveal that investigators presented a 340-page application for search authorization. Inside that application were transaction records linking specific fund disbursements to specific decisions made by specific individuals in identifiable positions within the organization's ranking and tournament governance structure. This is not the anatomy of a fishing expedition. This is the anatomy of a concluded investigation arriving at its enforcement phase. The officials whose communications were subpoenaed span multiple countries. They include individuals based in North America, 2 based in Western Europe, and at least 1 who operated primarily within the Asian tournament circuit, the region where Alex Ayah's competitive presence was most commercially significant and therefore apparently most threatening to the interests the fund protected. What happened inside the building when agents arrived has been described in various forms by individuals present that day. The word repeated consistently is stunned. Senior staff who had operated with complete confidence that the fund's architecture was invisible to outside scrutiny encountered for the first time the recognition that institutional power is not the same as institutional immunity. Phones were collected, laptops were imaged, external hard drives were removed from offices. A server room on the 2nd floor of the building was sealed and forensically analyzed over a period of 4 days. 3 individuals were escorted from the premises and instructed not to leave their respective jurisdictions pending further proceedings. Their legal representatives issued statements describing the investigation as politically motivated and procedurally irregular. Federal investigators declined to respond publicly to those characterizations, which legal observers noted is precisely what investigators do when they are confident their case is structurally sound. The broader tennis community's reaction was immediate and fractured. Players who had privately suspected that something corrupt was operating within the governance structure found themselves processing the confirmation of fears they had reluctantly articulate openly. Others, those whose careers had benefited from the landscape the fund created, faced a different kind of reckoning entirely. Can you imagine building a career on a surface that you suddenly discover was tilted? Can you imagine waking up to evidence that the competition you believed you had won fairly was, in some fundamental structural sense, not fair at all? That reckoning is coming for everyone in the sport, and it will not be comfortable. Alex Ayah did not immediately address the investigation publicly. This restraint was itself a statement. In an era of reflexive social media reaction, of instant hot takes and algorithmically rewarded outrage, Eala's silence in the initial 48 hours following the FBI story's emergence communicated something precise. She was not performing, she was processing. And when she eventually spoke, she chose her words with the same precision she deploys on a tennis court. Her statement, released through her management team, was a single paragraph. It did not name individuals. It did not speculate about the scope of the investigation. It acknowledged only that she had been aware for some time that elements of her competitive experience did not conform to what the rules of fair competition are supposed to guarantee, that she had raised concerns through appropriate channels at multiple points in her career and received responses she described as unsatisfactory, and that she supported the right of every athlete to compete on ground that has not been prepared against them. That last phrase, ground that has not been prepared against them, detonated across tennis forums, social media platforms, and sports journalism outlets with the force of a perfectly placed return winner. Within 6 hours, it was the most quoted sentence in sports media globally. Within 24 hours, it had generated over 40 million impressions across platforms. Within 72 hours, hashtag ground that has not been prepared against them was trending on 4 continents simultaneously. Athletes outside tennis began adding their voices. Olympians, basketball players, footballers. A solidarity statement signed by 73 professional players across 7 different sports described the alleged conduct as a fundamental betrayal of what competition is supposed to mean. The statement was notable not merely for its size, but for its geography. Signatories came from 21 different countries, many of them nations whose athletes have historically encountered structural obstacles within the governing bodies of their respective sports. Sponsors began moving. Not all of them, and not immediately, but 3 significant commercial partners suspended their WTA association within the first week, citing what their press releases carefully described as pending review of organizational governance integrity. Translation, they were watching to determine whether continued association carried reputational risk they were unwilling to absorb. Tournament directors in 3 different regions quietly contacted the investigation's lead attorney to express cooperation availability, legal language for ensuring they were positioned on the right side of whatever outcome emerged. The fund's defenders grew audibly quieter. The institutional machinery that had operated for years with confident impunity encountered something it had no protocol for: documented evidence, federal jurisdiction, and a global audience that had made up its mind before any trial commenced. Every sport carries within it the assumption of something sacred, that the outcome is determined by the players and not by the people who hold the administrative keys. When that assumption is violated at scale, when the violation is not a single corrupt official taking a payment, but a systematic, 10-year-long, $500 million architecture of manufactured inequality, the damage extends far beyond the individuals directly harmed. It poisons retrospectively every victory, every ranking, every tournament result produced within the contaminated period. It demands that athletes, fans, historians, and sponsors ask a question that has no comfortable answer. What was real? The investigation now proceeding will eventually produce verdicts. Individuals will either be charged or cleared. The fund's architects, if the allegations withstand judicial scrutiny, will face consequences calibrated to the scale of what they constructed. The WTA, as an institution, will undergo governance restructurate of a kind that organizations facing federal investigation rarely choose voluntarily and almost always require under judicial supervision. What cannot be reconstructed, even through the most thorough legal reckoning, is time. The tournaments Alex Ayah was denied, the ranking points she should have accumulated without interference, the sponsorship conversations that never happened because her name had been attached through the media operation the fund financed to controversies manufactured specifically to make her commercially inconvenient. She competed anyway. She excelled anyway. She forced a sport that was working against her to acknowledge her through sheer, undeniable, documented excellence. That achievement, winning in an environment actively engineered for her failure, may ultimately be more historically significant than any Grand Slam title. The question this moment places before the sport is not merely procedural. It is not simply about which officials should face prosecution or which governance structures require overhaul. The deeper question is this: how many Alex Ayahs were there? How many athletes from the wrong country, the wrong demographic, the wrong commercial market, athletes who carried the talent and the determination but encountered the manufactured friction and ultimately concluded with devastating logic that the barrier was simply too high? How many careers did the fund end before they began? How many potential champions did the world never see because an invisible financial architecture decided they were inconvenient? That question should be answered. That question demands to be answered. And the answer, whenever it arrives fully, will be the most important verdict this sport has ever faced. Professional tennis is standing at its most consequential crossroads. The path forward runs directly through accountability, not the performative accountability of press releases and governance committee reviews, but the structural accountability of federal prosecution, independent oversight, and a genuine commitment to ensuring that the ground is level for every player who steps onto it. Alex Ayah stepped onto tilted ground and refused to fall. Now, finally, the ground itself is being examined. Was this simply one young woman's story, or the beginning of a reckoning the entire architecture of professional sport has been avoiding for generations? Leave your answer below. This conversation is just beginning. The silence has been broken permanently. A $500 million secret fund, a whistleblower with the courage to carry documents out of a compromised institution, and a federal investigation that cannot be pressured, purchased, or managed into irrelevance. Alex Ayah competed against opponents on the court and adversaries off it, and she is still standing. The people who built the fund are not. If this story moved you, if you believe every athlete deserves genuinely level competition, subscribe, because this channel exists to follow the truth wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere powerful people desperately wished it wouldn't.